Hello, and welcome to the Community of Policy Professionals webinar series. My name's Louise Mamooney, and as host of our webinar today, I'd like to welcome you all and acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting today. I'm on Gadigal land, and wherever you may be joining us from, I recognise this land as Aboriginal land and acknowledge and welcome Aboriginal people who have joined us today as well. Today's webinar is on the way we do policy, and it's with Georgina Harrisson, Secretary of the Department of Education. And what a great topic title this is. Policy work is as much about the practice and activities we undertake to deliver and explore policy issues. The final product of policy is often the icing on the cake, but the real craft and skill is to bring together the many layers of effort and collaboration, knowledge, expertise, practical experience, and implementation and past policy practice and activity. Georgina has over 20 years of experience across a range of government agencies in New South Wales, the Commonwealth Government, and in the UK. She holds a Bachelor of Science with honours from the University of Birmingham. And most recently, she has led the New South Wales Education Transformation Agenda and was responsible for our COVID-19 response. Georgina's experience has given her great cause for optimism about the power of the public service to positively influence people's lives and the purpose that drives her work. Thank you for joining us today, Georgina. I'll pass over to you now, and there'll be plenty of time for questions from our audience, and I'll pop a note about that in the chat shortly. So Georgina, over to you.
Great, thank you for having me come and join you. And can I also acknowledge that I join you from Gadigal land today, Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I extend those respects to any Aboriginal colleagues joining us today. I'd also just highlight that as we look at some of the things that make great policy, self-determination and gathering the views and insights of the people who your policy is going to impact. It's actually really core to doing this well, and our First Nations people have always known that, continue to know that, and drive us to do better, and I thank them for that drive that they give us. So as Louise mentioned, my career has spanned many an agency in a variety of environments, from operations through to delivery, but my
Oh, Georgina, your mic is just turned off. Oh, we can hear you again. I think just press it once. Yep. Keep going.
No, see, I'm pressing it once and it's going twice. So you'll just have to wave at me if I kick off sound again. I have directed our IT department to focus their efforts on making schools IT work. So I have to accept what then happens in the department as a consequence of that. As I was saying, I've been through both kind of policy roles, governance roles, delivery roles. And throughout all of it, that power of government and public service and public policy to genuinely change people's lives has been at the heart of it. I come from a family whose lives were changed by the provision of social housing after the Second World War. I come from a family whose free education has changed the life trajectories of generations and generations to come. And that is all down to the work of people who had those brilliant ideas and created those opportunities to make it happen. There are a number of ingredients that go to making great policy, loads of them, right? You kind of, and in part, you definitely have to have the delivery right at the end of it. But the delivery will never be possible if your objective wasn't clear. If you didn't have all the ideas that were available to you on the table to test and see what was possible, if you didn't have data and evidence and insight, and I'll come back to insight a bit more later, and if you don't have a clear plan and a guiding coalition of people who really want to make something happen, it is in that list of ingredients that I see the role of policy and delivery being kind of inextricably linked. And so the delivery stuff's for another day, because without it, we won't see the benefit we want to see. But policy at its heart provides that clear objectives and develops those ideas that can change the world. Policy is a process of identifying and solving at least part of our biggest problems as a society. But I think all of this can sound kind of We can pitch ourselves as being solving the big problems. We can also undersell what we do as not being that. And it absolutely is. The pitch is big here. We are here to solve problems that other people have not yet solved. It is driven by an insatiable belief that we can make things better, that there are questions that aren't answered. And it's almost that drive of humankind that we have had from the dawn of time to continue to make things better that drives essential and high quality policy work. Oh, I've got background noise there. Thank you. Hi, guys. And of course, the more these ideas kind of are coupled with that relentless focus on delivery, the better the impact we can have. So today I just wanted to touch a bit on what I think makes great policy, and importantly, the way you need to do it in order to make great policy. And that in the way that you set up, to be really clear, the way you set that up at the beginning will lead to whether or not you have a success at the end. If you do not get the beginning bit right, you will not see the outcomes at the end. Making policy well is an intellectual and human endeavour. It involves great relationships. It involves understanding and connecting with people as much as it involves deeply analysing data and disappearing into a corner to understand the evidence and sort through all that information. It requires passion over emotion. It requires rational thought over anecdote. And it requires contest over agreement. It requires a contestability of ideas to really test what we're doing is right. So hi, my name's George and I'm a policy wonk and I'm proud. And I'm proud because it is all of those ingredients that makes what we do so important and makes good policy impact. So good policy and a good policy process starts by getting clear on our objective. What is it we are trying to do? Too often we're not clear on that. Too often we're trying to solve 10 things with one idea. Too often we don't take the time up front to get really clear on the thing we want to achieve. Next, absolutely everything that we can keep on the table should stay on the table. You often, if you go to the courses on this, people talk about the solution space in problem solving. What's in the solution space? Very often in our world, that solution space is constrained by existing policy, by legislation, by the views of individuals and individual people or stakeholder groups. The bigger we can push out the boundaries of that solution space, the more we can make possible. And so claim as much of that space as you can in order to ensure that we can really tackle the objective we have put down on the table. You have to know the constraints, but you've got to be prepared to challenge them. Legislation is by far the least useful tool at times in the policy space, one we can go to quickly and too easily. And at other times, it can be a barrier to making any change. It has to be on the table in the way we do our thinking and start a process. If you knock it out too soon, you lose opportunity. We need to gather every possible insight to drive towards that solution. I work in an area which I would argue is driven by anecdote at the moment far more than we use evidence and data. And actually, those anecdotes can be turned into data if we take the best of social research principles and we sample staff, the community, and really understand what is going on the ground. We can create data out of that human insight that can inform what we do alongside the more traditional data now that we would seek to engage in a process. So that insight is vital, that balance between what data is telling us and what our people are telling us and the community we serve are telling us all come into the kind of insights that we need to help guide our decision making. We have to seek to avoid the power of a good anecdote and confirm or deny its value in that sampling exercise. They can be so compelling and persuasive. You can so easily be swayed by one person's view of the world. It is our job to test every single one of those views as policy professionals. It is our job to test them and see if they are right. We need to consider the big levers we might have available. We need to look up and out at what others are doing in different parts of the world, in different parts of public policy, and think, could we just do this very differently? What would we turn on its head? And at the end of it, we need to condense all that work, not into the PhD thesis it probably deserves, and that we could each probably write on all of the ideas and the work we've put into it. But we have a more challenging task. We have to boil all of that information down into a concise piece of communication. In communication that can influence decision making, into communication that can persuade the community that what we're doing is the right thing, into a communication that can lead the change and the start of the change we want to see in a system. And at the start of that change is the delivery starting to happen. It's when we, in a sense, we hand over the baton. But too often we are so proud of the work we have done that we want to show everybody. The best service we can give to everyone is to keep that to ourselves, to condense that thinking into a piece of communication that will influence and persuade, because that is at the heart of getting a decision that will allow us to move forward. So to be great policy, you've got to thrive in uncertainty while creating uncertainty for others, because you've got to be the people who are ready to ask the question of what next. In the face of people who say that's not possible, you need to be able to say, yes, it is, and we can do more. You've got to be the optimist at the table, believing that things can get done and things can change. I've been privileged to work on some of those big reforms that have been described as once in a generation or changing the community. Every single one of those reforms have left me with a list of questions of the next thing I would like us to do. No one of them has solved the whole problem or the whole issue that we wanted to solve. They're just a step forward on the path. And so never thinking that you've finished the job, there's another job to do. And sometimes that might mean you need to step away and do that work in a different area because you've taken something to where you can for now. You need to hand the baton to someone who can bring a different set of eyes, a fresh objectivity to the set of problems in an area. But these are the things that give me the passion to keep going. The what next, the where next, how do we move this forward? The Department of Education has led some groundbreaking reforms over many decades. The Gonski reforms, New South Wales Department of Education really drove a lot of that work. But I'd say we lost our mojo somewhere in the midst of all of that, a little bit around education policy. We're starting to get it back. We're consciously building it. And we'll be putting out a policy framework that will get shared, I'm sure, with this community about the way we want to do policy well, how we want to work with our community, with our staff, with the expertise available to us to help us solve some of the challenges we face. And so I'm George and I'm a policy wonk and I'm proud, and it is great to be in the company of other policy wonks across government. It's hard work to get credit for, but it's really, really important work, and it feeds the rest of what government does. You shape and drive decision-making in government every day. If I now get to sit in those cabinet meetings, ERC meetings, and see that work come forward, the persuasive case you can make changes the direction of government policy. It changes the direction of society, and it really matters. So be a policy wonk and be proud. And Louisa, I'm really happy to take everybody's questions.
Are you ready for questions now?
As they come, yes.
Yes. Okay. Great. So I'm happy for you to ad-lib more. But if our audience now could, I will start off with a few questions for you. So we'll give our audience a few moments to think as well. But our audience, if you could put your question in the meeting chat, and then I'll coordinate the order of those questions, and when I call you forward, please turn your camera on and ask your question, and you might also want to introduce the agency that you're from as well, so that we know where you sit in the world. Yeah, I'll open with a few questions while people are putting their thinking caps on. And thanks for reclaiming the term policy wonk for us, and perhaps we should change our name to the community of policy wonks, but I'll leave that for further consideration. Tell us, how did you get into policy? It probably wasn't something that you started out with, so tell us a bit more about your journey to this point.
Yeah, so this will be a bit of a declaration. When I first started working in government in the UK in the far stream, I came out of a science degree, which was all about critical and analytical thinking. And I landed myself in an environment in the Department of the Home Office in the UK, where none of that critical or analytical thinking, quite frankly, seemed to matter. It was all about how you drafted something. It was all about drafting and communication in a different way that I had learned in a scientific degree. It was a very valuable way, actually, of communicating. It was a very persuasive style, but it was very narrative-based, quite a lot of storytelling, actually, in retrospect. And I spent the first 2 to 3 years of my career wondering what this thing called policy was that everyone talked about. Oh, you do policy. Oh, they're the jobs you want. And I found myself in our graduate program landing in an operational job in immigration, landing then in what people said was a policy job, but it seemed to me to be doing nothing of much impact very slowly. And I couldn't quite work out as I sat in this, is this policy thing people keep talking about writing briefs? Is that what it is? Is this policy thing people are talking about going to these meetings? I'm finding myself in Europe and trying to stay awake while a whole load of people who don't really seem to care about what we're talking about go around and take their turns saying something about nothing. And I really struggled to find where the care factor was about this policy. Why was this the thing? And then interestingly, I went to work in the Prime Minister's delivery unit, and it was there that I saw that when you don't have good policy, you cannot deliver a good outcome. You just can't. I worked on a review of why trains didn't run on time in the UK. And literally, the policy around the privatisation of the railways had been set up in such a way that trains running late were a money merry-go-round for the private operators. So they spent more time arguing about who was responsible for the late train because they got the penalty money, which was more profitable than anything else, than they did caring about whether passengers got to their destination on time. And the later the train was, the bigger the dollars were at stake. And so all of the incentives that had been set up in a privatisation policy of the railways were working against the very thing actually most people wanted to see, which was a reliable service where trains turned up on time. And working in immigration and seeing that all of the policies that we had weren't being implemented well, because actually they couldn't be practically implemented well, really shone a light for me back upstream on where were the issues getting in the way. And on a piece of work we did in drugs at that time, being really clear that actually no one was taking ownership for a whole set of issues, that our policy was actually a law, it wasn't a position that we were following, and that where that law had failed, in a sense, like the law was quite clear, drugs are bad, don't do drugs, don't bring drugs into the country, don't deal drugs, all of those punitive measures, we thought we were done. But actually we had no policy for what we did for the people whose lives had been ruined by the fact those laws, in a sense, weren't enough. And so I got to this position as I drove delivery of things to see that every time we were trying to make something happen, we hit a roadblock, and inevitably, in nearly every circumstances, it was the wrong policy to our objective. And that actually, when you went back through it, the policy objective hadn't been clear. When we privatised the railways, it was a different question. It was, how do we save the government money by offloading this set of things? It wasn't a service or quality question, so the objective wasn't clear. And a whole set of things were taken out of the table of the solutions because we needed to keep the market attractive for different people to come into it. So you kind of, as you look at that delivery spectrum and say, why is this not happening? You could find yourself back at the root cause. And so that's where my passion for policy really started. It started alongside trying to make the change, trying to deliver change and finding you couldn't if the ideas you were trying to implement didn't work. And if the intellectual rigor wasn't behind them, and that there wasn't a good guiding coalition of people who bought into the idea, even if it was the right one.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask Susie to come on and ask a question because I think it follows on nicely.
Hi, Susie, how are you? This is one of mine. This is one of the education folk. We know each other, but Susie, you should introduce yourself to everyone else. I see, Department Tech.
Yeah, we can't hear you, and I've only got a choice to mute you, which is not going to help you.
Is that better?
Oh, yes, we can hear you now.
Great. Hi, everybody. Susie Lai from Department of Education, working on the Rewarding Excellence in Teaching project. And I guess This is something we're trying to write the policy for and deliver pretty immediately next year. And I guess that comment about doing really great policy and really great thinking doesn't land very well if you can't bring it all together concisely and communicate it to the people that you need to communicate it to, both the people you're delivering for, but also the people you're trying to convince to give you money or to, announce things. So I'm wondering if you can share any creative ways you've seen that people have communicated policy or that have been particularly persuasive for government.
Yes, it's interesting. I worked for something I found really frustrating when I worked for them at the time, because I felt that they were really in the detail of the words, but they were really in the detail of the words because they could see that we were only going to achieve the first step of something, and all of the words needed to leave room for the questions to be answered that we still had to answer. And so I think in some of these times where you feel, the rush comes, right? The rush comes because government have got a deadline, or, suddenly, especially at the minute, because we're in that period, someone's got an idea and the time is short to make something of that idea. I think you have to consistently leave room for the follow-up questions. And I think when you talk to people about it, particularly when you're communicating to a workforce or the community about it, you have to manage those expectations in the follow-up that there is more to come and things we will need to work through. And I think you have to keep leaving room for the unanswered questions to be answered. I think the other thing is we shouldn't see policy as a one-off activity that's static. Oh, I had my idea, it's being implemented now and we're fine. It's just not, it's alive. It's alive every day, and it is changed every day by the changing environment in which it's operating in. So, we might think what we're doing today is an absolutely brilliant idea and fits the environment today. We've just seen with the pandemic that 2 years can rapidly change your environment, just rapidly change your environment, and you have to think again. And so having that capacity where we are continually looking, I think, is something as a public service we can really build. And so that we keep going back to government. One of my biggest frustrations is when other people have the ideas. I want us to be bombarding them with the good stuff, and the good stuff that keeps us aligned and helps us to hold a course of implementation and hold people, because policy does become a managing change process. It's just that you're at the very start of it. And so you've got to have a way of holding that through. And so ways you do it is with phasing. I think we can overuse things. We've been in a test and learn phase around government. That's, we've had pilots, we've had flagships, we've had lighthouses, all these ways that we try and construct a limit around what's possible today. The challenge with that stuff is you never see the impact of it, actually. You never get to see the real impact of your work if you contain it. And so I think it's better to say, what we're going to do is this bit, and then we're going to review, and we're going to come back and we're going to look at what needs to change next. Because we should be able to get to a more grown-up conversation with the community at large that says we won't get it right, all of the time. First go. But we'll make some progress and we'll come back again and we'll keep coming back. And it's that relentless questioning. Anyone who works with me knows I ask like 1 million questions, and it can feel like a barrage, but it's how I learn. And it is that kind of learning by questioning of others, because you're then listening to learn all the time, listening to learn, listening to refine our thinking. And I think that really helps us in the policy space. What next? What is the next thing we'll need to do? So I think my advice on this one, Susie, is we shouldn't see it as the end. It's just the first step. And we can too easily as policy professionals, and I do think that's what we are, feel like we need to tie a bow around it and say, that's it forever, my job done. Well, it's not. Don't tie the bow. Let's not wrap it up. Let's just be really clear in our own head. This is the first step and we'll take the next one. And we'll be ready for the opportunity for the next step and to create the opportunity for the next step when it comes.
Thank you. Our next question is from Stephanie, who has a particular question about communication for a cabinet audience. Stephanie, would you like to come on and ask your question?
Hi, Georgina. Thanks so much for your presentation so far. It's been really, really nice to listen to some of your tips and tricks for policy professionals. I'm Steph. I currently work in Digital New South Wales, working on digital identity policy. And I just had a practical question. When drafting a new policy proposal for Cabinet, what are your tips or ideas around how much evidence we should be referencing, how we actually reference that, whether it's in attachments or footnotes, which I understand aren't the norm, or do we simply communicate that we have bodies of research or evidence? And yeah, do you have some ideas around that?
Yeah, so I do have you. So I think partly back. My first thing is we should back ourselves, right? So aside from one of the things I've discovered is that if you go alongside a cabinet submission with the word menopause in it, seems like you get money. Like I'm just, and as soon as that word gets said out loud in a cabinet room, everything gets a yes and they move on, and that was great. But I do think there are certain things that we need to remember. We have worked. That's why I talk about not writing a PhD thesis. That's not what we need. We do need it in our process. We do need all of that evidence there. We need to be able to, we need to reference it. We need to talk our minister through it. Our minister will go into cabinet and put forward our proposal for us. We need to give our ministers confidence the evidence is there backing up what we're saying so that they can sell it for us in the room. And so I think we sometimes underdo that part with ministers because actually it's a confidence thing, right? Our ministers have got to have confidence that the advice we're giving them is right. And so I often see the cabinet minute being seen as the product. It is not the product. It is the decision-making tool. It is not the product. The product is everything else you've done to get there. And so your job in getting there is to build the confidence of the senior officers, that the evidence is there and we've got this right. And that confidence builds confidence, right? It's a kind of strange phenomenon, but it happens. By doing good work at the beginning, your boss sees it, their boss sees it, the minister then sees it. And then it's enough in the cabinet minute to say international best practice or the evidence shows or whatever it is, because you've convinced everyone along the way and every single one of them can answer the question. And you've put that in your policy process when you're sat around with other government officials around, different departments discussing, digital policy, identity policy, because it impacts on a lot of this. You've shown them that as well. So when your cohort comments go out, they've all seen that and learned that already. So I think we can overplay wanting to show our working when actually what we need to do is build confidence in the public service to do this work well, that anyone coming looking when they're standing order 52, absolutely everything we do, can see that incredible logical thought process that's gone in. But I am a big subscriber to the pyramid principle of communication. And if you haven't read the book by Barbara, somebody used to be a McKinsey partner, actually, they communicate this stuff really well. Actually, we bring all sorts of consultants in to do all sorts of things. In my experience, McKinsey have this clearest communication model for how you communicate what you're trying to do and why, and you only use the evidence that really supports what you're trying to do. But everyone's got to have confidence in the process that got you there. So I don't think you need to oversell your working. You need to make people confident on the way through.
Perfect. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question is from Bronwyn. Bronwyn, would you like to come on and ask your question?
Yes, just getting my education department tech to work as well.
They're playing with us today.
Right, that's it. No more questions from education after this.
Thanks for that talk, George. I've found it really useful so far. I wanted to ask about interactions with ministers' offices and government generally. So we've seen that in the recruitment space, examples of public servants just too easily doing what ministers wanted them to do. I'm thinking of the Barilaro affair. But I've actually been thinking about in terms of policy. I've had the experience, sadly too often, of working on a policy project and the message is, oh, the minister's office wants it this way, so that's what we're going to do. Or alternatively, that might be a nice idea, but no, I'm sorry, the minister's office is not going to like that. So I was just wondering if you have advice around those of us who get to actually interact with the office, what might be practical ways of pushing back against that? But then also organisationally, is there a way of building a culture that allows us to push back in a kind of more thoroughgoing way against that kind of limitations on what might be possible for a policy?
Yeah, thanks, Bronwyn. And a very timely question, because I think we're at a point in the political cycle where that's even more acute for most agencies at this time. And I do think there are opportunities created by some of the recent events that mean we can reclaim some of the space that I do see getting lost after long periods of government, actually, as well, because everyone gets a bit too comfortable. And so I'm really conscious of that. And so I've been sitting with our exec going, it is our advice, and it relates to the answer I just gave, actually. If we are building government's confidence in our ability to do policy well, then actually it is our advice and it is credible advice, and we should be putting it on the table. And sometimes it'll take years, right? So the thing about really good policy, if you take something like the NDIS, still not right in delivery terms, but as a policy position, I think a really credible one still, that took years. That took years of different interventions to make that possible, big scale reform. But I think we have to build the credibility, because at the minute, what I see coming back from government is, you guys don't give us the ideas, so we have to have them. You are not forensically going through the systems you lead across the whole of government and saying, here are the next things we need to tackle. And so in a sense, we head into this conversation already having that kind of the boundaries put around what's possible, because it's coming from a political position rather than one of evidence and data. And so I think the first thing we need to do is get in earlier and be putting more stuff up. That means there's more for them to choose from, right? The second thing is we should give our advice. It is our advice. They don't have to like it. And I keep saying this to all of our executive leadership group in the department here in education. We put our advice, they have the opportunity to say we don't agree and we want to do something else. But it's not our job to either get in the way or make things easy. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's our job to be the honest broker of advice, frank and fearless. And so I think it's fair to say, I'm really happy to explore that issue for you. I can see what you're trying to achieve. I'll come back to you when I've considered, you know, if it's in a discussion, I'll come back to you when we've considered that with what we see the options are and the relative weightings of them. And so what you do is you go back to them with analysis that isn't, when I see stuff come through, one of the things I'd observe is when we're trying to defend our own position, we come across as defensive. Because we've already put the work in and we want something to happen. So how do we step back and say, well, they want A, we think B is a better idea. Let me do an objective analysis of those two things and then let them make a choice, because they are the elected officials once they get that far at the end of the day, but let me give them my advice. And so I'd always say, take their idea, get an objective, and it's like I say passion, but not emotion. And this is the stuff I mean, like, we have to passionately care about the outcome. We've got to take the emotion out of how much effort we've put into something and how committed we are to something we've already said, in order to have that kind of dispassionate objectivity, emotion-free objectivity on what will work. So that's my advice. And that is how I spend my life, Bronwyn, in those conversations. So I'm really happy that others start pushing that too.
Yeah. And thank you. I know it can be challenging, but I think that reflection on, you know, we are public servants, what is the best advice that we can give at any point in time is important. Now, Dan has a question about some of the bigger challenges. So I think Dan is coming on to ask his question now.
Am I on?
Yes.
Georgina. Thanks, Louisa. Georgina, thanks for your presentation talk. It's Dan Murphy, CZ. Georgina, my question is, you mentioned you were the beneficiary of sweeping historic reforms like universal public housing and free tertiary education. Do you ever think that policy thinking today, particularly in education, is too timid or constricted by political limits and is not tackling fundamental policy challenges? I mean, do you ever get the feeling that you're just sort of tinkering at the edges?
I get the feeling that we're building up to the big stuff rather than tinkering at the edges. And I go back to what I've said already. You have to build the confidence of those that are the decision makers ultimately to do something bold and different. You have to look at that, all of the actors involved in that, and see the different roles they're playing at different times. And I kind of, from where I am now in an industrial conversation, for example, I'm really looking forward to the school funding debate, when actually our work in partnership with some of those industrial bodies will be very different around some of that school funding. And I think it connects to Bronwyn's question. We have not yet, as an organisation, and I think we need to really put out an alternative bold agenda or started the conversation with government about how we'd change it. I'd say we haven't done all of that work yet. And so it is often driven by, and I don't say this is a criticism actually, but value and emotion over how we make the objective case. Because actually the objective case in education, for example, is that we are given enough money to deliver a quality education relative to other places in the world that achieve outcomes, etc. So there's a whole host of kind of, if we think they're the wrong measures, we need to be doing the work that allows us to challenge them. So I think there are kind of questions around what are the objective measures and how do you change the dynamics in some of that in order to see a different path forward. But again, I suppose part of my job is holding back the let us keep our advice. The other part is pushing the ambition of governments to take on bigger challenges. And I know it doesn't look like it from the outside, but we do a lot of that in the background, right? One of the other things about being a policy wonk is it's kind of the faceless bureaucrat. I think people try and throw around as an insult, and I think it's a real compliment because it's not about ourselves or the self adulation we might get from the work. It's actually about the product and the impact. And so behind the scenes, pushing where you can for the ambition you want to see, I think is a really important role we can play. We're in the right places. That for us as public officials is with governments more often than not. What an incredibly privileged position to be in.
Thank you, and we look forward to working up to those bigger challenges. And I think, I mean, sometimes it's not the policy is a hard work, and it's the small changes that we make along the way that do make the difference. But we've got to wait for those windows, for the opportunity and the confidence and the capability to meet those bigger challenges as well. When they
Louise, I would just add to that, we also have to be prepared to get out of our own way. And so that can be quite hard too, right? So I would say, Dan, in order to have those big discussions in some systems, and I think they've done it in some places, I think the NDIS did it, it took all of the value of, it took a whole load of like expected values around the way we would deliver, for example, group home care, and said, you know what, that doesn't work for the people we're trying to provide care for. So we should look at a different way. You know, we used to keep families out of investing and running in a group care environment for their own children. And now we've gone, hold on a minute, families are invested in the lives of their children for their whole lives, and they want to be part of that. And there are ways we could do that would be different. But to do that, the government, the state had to get out of its own way. And so it was prepared to look at everything on the table. And I think one of the things that stops us in education is that we draw our own boundary really tightly about what's possible. And I think that gets in the way of us really putting bold advice up sometimes.
Thank you. And our next question is from Lisa.
Hi, Georgina. Thank you for your time today and for the opportunity to ask questions. I'm Lisa Fadul from Closing the Gap team in Education and Skills Reform.
I don't just bring a posse with me everywhere I go, by the way. This is not a requirement. There was no edict across the department that said, come and support me and ask questions. This looks terrible. Carry on, Lisa. Great.
So my question is, how do we ensure Aboriginal voices are embedded into all of our policies and at the same time ensure that our policies are culturally safe for Aboriginal communities?
Yes, this goes against the time pressure we can often find ourselves in, doesn't it? And so I think the way that we do this, Lisa, is to have an ongoing dialogue with Aboriginal people around education. That means that we can build the trust so that when we need to go and ask a specific question, we have the structures in place that allow us to do so. I think we also need to not lose sight of what our job in that is. And so one of my observations in this space, and I'm really happy to, if there are people who disagree, to challenge me on it, but if we are capturing the voice, that doesn't mean we get to step away from our own responsibilities for delivery. So I'm really struck that in education, the Aboriginal Education Consultative Group say, stop coming to talk to me about things that are your job, just do them better. Now, I think that's a really interesting challenge because we want to go and talk to them about how we make things better today. And they're saying, well, if you just stop suspending our kids more than you suspend other kids, as required by your current policy, if you just did your current job better, we could then talk about something else. And so I think there's a real responsibility for us in leading big systems and looking at policies to make sure that in the implementation of our current policies, we are implementing them in a way that creates that psychological safety, that doesn't inadvertently demonstrate a sense of almost institutional bias at times that can come out through the actions of individuals or the system and the way we expect it to operate. Because I think we have to build the trust first by doing the things we do now well for Aboriginal people. And I'd say in education, we've got a long way to go, as evidenced by the closing the gap measures, actually, that we need to do that. And then I think we need to be prepared to then have a different conversation with Aboriginal communities about education, which goes to Dan's question, really. What is the big space they want to talk about? What does it look like? And I think we've seen some real gains in that, actually. Like I think the new Aboriginal languages syllabus and having the opportunity to learn language in all our schools from K to 10. I'm really glad I get to be in this system while that happens. I just think that, and that has come from community with community through absolutely decades of hard work by Aboriginal people across all parts of government to get us to a point that that's where we are. And so I'm really proud of that step forward. But I think we need an ongoing dialogue is the short answer to your question, so that Aboriginal people can raise the issues that really matter to them. But I'm really struck that's only going to work if we deliver on our promises today. Until we do that, why would anything change from their perspective in that conversation? Why would they trust us with the next thing?
Thank you.
It's a very important point that for government to deliver policy, it needs to have the confidence of the community that it's doing what it needs to do without, making a big deal of it at every turn. Now we're turning to some other stakeholders now. Louise has a question on stakeholder expectations.
Yeah, so hi, and I think it's a good segue, and I think you might have answered some of this question throughout your previous responses, but really keen. I'm Louise Ryan, I'm the CEO in ESR. There's a lot of big voices within education, a lot of big stakeholders, and I guess I'm after your best advice on managing those expectations of stakeholders during the policy development process.
Yeah, so I think it's a really good question, because I think sometimes, and this applies across all walks of government and policy, right? Sometimes in trying to do the right thing, we create a set of expectations that we can never meet. And I've watched this happen. I've watched us go and have conversations about everything we'd want to happen and give so much voice without any parameters around it, that actually what comes back is unworkable for anybody, and all you're going to get then is all-round disappointment. And so we do this, and it's quite interesting hearing a question on the digital stuff. We do this in the digital space too, right? We go and say, we're going to get a system that can do everything for you and save all your problems. But actually, we then look at designing something we can't afford to implement or upkeep. So we end up with an expensive system, which inevitably is filled with flaws that we then can't afford to fix or maintain, because we're trying to do we were trying to do the right thing around design thinking to gather all the inputs. And so I think it does relate to my last question. We do have to stand strong in the things we are responsible for doing and doing well. I think you have to set clear expectations, but I think you need to do some work first. I think sometimes we hold off talking to stakeholders too long, and other times we rush out the door straight away before we have got clear with, and I kind of, all the jargon around this when you go and study it, you kind of, have you got your authorising environment clear? Do we know what the constraints are that we have to work within? Have we got some sense of that before we walk out the door and have a conversation? And then I'd also argue we don't put a lot of time into planning those conversations. There are people who make a living off running a workshop, and they do so because there is an art to it. And I think it's one of the underlooked skills actually of policy development is managing a collaborative forum. And I think you have to learn how to do that. You have to go and learn some workshop techniques if you haven't already. When you're going into stakeholders, depending on the point of the process you're in, you have to have ways of not accepting every idea as equal. You have to have ways of whittling it down. So I would never do just a free-for-all round table. I would just not, it's fine for some things, but you've got to have a process in it that says, okay, which are the 3 things we think are most important? And we'll take those away. And where have we got disagreement? Because the other thing you want to do in this is make sure you're clear that not everyone agrees with it. We used to use this brilliant, I'm such a fan of it. It's old school tech, but we used to use this thing called Pinpoint, and it is big sheets of brown paper and a lot of stickers and stationery. You know, who doesn't love a trip to Kiki K? It's that kind of thing, you know, and it is lightning bolt stickers for things you see that you disagree with, love hearts for the things you think we should do more of. Actually different, you know, write the worst things that could ever happen on the red cards, because that will bring out your most negative thinking possible. All of that is a technique that leads you to more of a consensus position in the space that you're trying to work in. So I think we need to, I think it's an area we need to think harder about before we walk in the room. We have to be really clear, and the whole team has to be clear. So it's one of the things I think we don't do well enough in, you know, if I think about the conversations I have, I don't know that I'm always as clear as I need to be with people. Actually, on this one, these are the parameters. And sometimes it's really tight, right? Sometimes it's, we don't want to tell anyone about this because we're going to make it a big surprise. We will often say back in response to that, don't recommend it, not a great idea. We'll often be proved right. However, that remains part of the world we work in. And so I think really thinking about, if you don't know, ask your manager, ask your director, your ED, whoever, and get clear. And just keep, you know, almost don't walk in the room unprepared, I think is one of the other key things. Know the conversation you want to have and the limits of what you can take away from it.
Very good advice. Our next question is from Katie on longer term objectives. Katie, would you like to come on?
Sorry, so my name's David. Katie's next to me. We're colleagues. No, it's okay. I was just using her. We're on one of the screens here. We're both in early childhood regulation inside the Department of Education. And I think one thing we've picked up on is that kind of those interactions at a really early age kind of transcend across the educational journey. So in terms of policy, it may not be immediate, but the student outcomes happen 5, 10, 15 years later. So I guess my question, and it's quite conceptual, but how do you balance kind of wanting to do reforms, maybe for student outcomes or something, while also just acknowledging that things take time to flow through? Kind of those, it's a bit of a hard question, but
so I just get to spook my favourite books here a little bit. Go and read Cotter's Leading Change if you haven't already. You cannot get long-term reform if you don't have things that point towards success along the way. You have to be able to show progress. You have to be able to build. And I feel like a bit of a fraud sat here saying this, given I've had my workforce out in the streets 3 times in the last 12 months and a day of action. So, you know, we don't always get it right, and nor do we always have the opportunity for it to be perfect. But I think for the things that really matter, you have to know what it is that we've got success. So if I take student outcomes, in order to give early childhood time for its work to land, I need to make sure that some things are happening between years 5 and 10 that show that we're not falling off a cliff. I need to be able to show that actually in public education, our HSC students are getting better results. They did last year, they will again this year, because of work we are doing. And so you have to look at the whole system and say, where are the things that continue to keep room for that work to continue and have the time to show its value? And so I think that's part of what you have to do. You don't have the luxury of just saying, we've got this great idea and you need to wait 10 years. We need to be able to say, we've got this great idea. I mean, the early childhood investment this government is committed to, and I think we'll get bipartisan support for, like it's the ultimate in an early intervention swing, right? And in a sense, what's fascinating is the rest of government have been calling for this, and we've now managed to pull it off. But we've also got money for other people. Like, this is not a one agency thing. This is a whole of government agenda to really get the first 2,000 days of life right, so that every young person is set up with a foundation for the future that they deserve. That is the ultimate, isn't it, in early intervention? Like, to swing the needle and get that much money in the front end of the system. And it's the kind of thing that once you've done, you're gonna, you know, you've got a really good chance of holding on to. So the big, bold moves matter, but to sustain them, you've got to have those wins along the way. And even if they're not directly in early childhood, if they're in another part of the education life cycle, or if they're in another agency, even if it's, even if you need to continue to get better acute outcomes in A&E, for example, you need performance in A&E to do well while you also try and drive down the attendance at A&E. It's a similar kind of agenda. You've got to have the wins along the way that keep community confidence in your overall strategy. But yeah, John Cotter, Leading Change, it's an oldie but a goodie, that one. And every time I think he does a re-release of the book, when he says when he talks about communication, I think the first one says we under-communicate by a factor of 10. He went to 100 and now thinks he's at over 1,000. That is the thing that I am constantly reminding myself of, actually. We think we've said it, we put it in the last EDM that, 30% of people open because they're frontline staff and they're not interested. We've told people it's fine. We haven't convinced anyone, and they're not chanting it. And I think I'm really fascinated in the private sector, the amount of money and effort they put into selling purpose to their staff. And here we are in the public sector with the purpose entirely taken for granted, and we're then not harnessing what actually we've got as intrinsic value in our system for the change we want to see. So yeah, over-communicate. And if you think you're over-communicating, you're probably not getting close to the level of communication that's actually required to drive change.
Yeah, and having studied change management recently, everything that they talk about in change management is basically a policy textbook. So so it's really worth paying attention to. A lot of thought has been put into the areas that we can learn from, even though it's primarily kind of private sector examples that they normally talk about. I think our next question, which I'm really keen to get to, is on the links between program delivery and policy interactions. But Belinda, I think that question was from you. Here she is. Great.
Hi, sorry, also on the education tech train. Thanks, George.
They all get paid later in cake and stuff. Fine.
Well, I hope they get paid, but
on a good week. When that system's working, I'm joking.
I'm Belinda, I'm in the disability strategy team, and George, my question is picking up on some of the comments you've made in response to the other questions, and it's about the policy delivery continuum and the idea that a lot of our programs and initiatives are a first step of tackling a much bigger problem. And in an agency as large as education, I guess I'm keen to hear your tips on maintaining the policy intent in implementation and ensuring our opportunities for continuous improvement to avoid that kind of layering of new programs or commitments in an already complex system, and how we keep that work on the agenda so we don't move on to the next thing and allow that to fall into a category of BAU. And I think that particularly, I guess, it can be an issue of, I think, capability often in our policy and operational delivery, in that we don't have the follow through or I guess governance in place to allow that cycle to be circular.
Yeah, good question. It relates well to the last one, actually. The kind of there's almost kind of, how do you keep the focus for the long term? I think I'm hearing in that when the space is crowded, everyone wants a new thing. How do you keep the alignment to what you're doing? So I think the first thing is coming back to purpose regularly. I think you can. It's interesting because so we did in education here a piece of work called the disability strategy that really was a first step, and none of the programs underneath it in the first step were particularly worked through at the point where it was a very high level strategy, but it was a statement of intent that in itself shifted the dial. It was also one where we did some brilliant engagement with the sector and stakeholders, but also probably raised expectations beyond what we could deliver in the short term. And then what we've started on, I think, are a lot of the quick win reforms that keep people interested and assured that we're all on the right lines. What I think we haven't found yet, Belinda, is a way to articulate the grand vision here and how it all fits together. And so we're doing lots of these little things, but what difference will it make for a student for disability? If we look at when we get to 2035, what is the school experience and how will it be different? I don't think we've done I think the persona work that people do for storytelling about the future, what it might look like, I don't think we've quite got to that level of thinking that then connects through to other bits of the organisation. And so it's a task of leadership in organisations to maintain focus so we can get to that. I would say in the disability space, if the Department of Education had gone out with that, it would have had zero credibility actually 5 years ago, because we were so far from being where we would need to be that there wouldn't have been belief that we meant it. It would have been, we wouldn't have had any credibility in the bank. I think we've got that. And so we're in a position we can start working on that kind of in 2035, what do we think this will look like for every school building, for every teacher, for every student? And I think that's the next piece of work we need to do. So it's kind of with any policy cycle, and it's not helped by changing personnel, can I say, at times. Like I think when we lose leadership and leadership changes, priorities kind of get buffeted around. And this is where I think people on this call, you play a really important role. So Belinda, my challenge to you is how do you shape that up? Now I've got a role to play for sure, but so have a lot of people between me and, between me and the system. And so what is it that you do that says, okay, let's do a stock take of where we are. Let's get clear on what the next thing is. Is it time to revisit purpose, energy and commitment to what we're doing? How are we going to go about doing that? It's the human side of the endeavour that we need to get clear on in that. Is it time to, do we need to play that up and then play the thinking part up later? And so I think they're really good questions that in that policy space, you need to be thinking about where are we on the appetite for reform? Where are we in the commitment for reform? Where are we in the relative priorities of an organisation? And if we're not clear, how are we going to find out? So I am a real advocate. My parents think it's hilarious that I'm in this job because I've literally never had any respect for authority at any point in my life, right? So the idea that I'm in a position of authority, they find quite hilarious. But it's one of the great places where hierarchy gets in the way. And I think everyone in a hierarchy who thinks it's in the way has an opportunity to test it and challenge it by going, hold on a minute, you told me this work, like, how do I constructively have a conversation about this piece of work and where it now sits in the organisation and where we're going to take it? That is part of securing your policy kind of space. What are my constraints? Where am I? How big and bold an idea am I allowed to put up? Because actually we've got some really good ideas here and I want to create the room for them. Creating the space. I do feel like I'm like a librarian. I moved into a new house and I've finally got bookshelves. So I have been like unloading books and having like a moment of like, oh, I've got books back in my life. But Mark Moore's public value, creating the space for the work, is part of the work. And so I would urge everyone in that kind of position to try and create that space for your work, if only to find out whether or not it's currently something we can progress. And for your own self as a kind of in your career, I know this is not the case in disability, but if you find yourself in a place where you've got really big, bold ideas, but it's not the right time, you have to make a decision about whether you're going to spend your energy there or not. I'm going to reiterate, Belinda, that's not the case in disability. And particularly in those reforms, but in other places I've been in that position and I've gone, right, I don't want to stay here. I worked on high-tech crime in the early 2000s when it was more 12-year-old, probably still is, isn't it, 12-year-old hackers in Russia, but there was no appetite for anyone to think about that world differently. There was no appetite to take on the emerging big internet companies or the IT bubble or any of that. And I was like, well, this is not a place I'm going to be able to do the work I want to do. This is not where I want to stay. And so I think you also have to go, okay, if that's not the priority, if I can't have the impact or do the work I want to do, then I'm going to go and do something else. So I think those conversations of space creating are really important for the work and for people in this area who don't want to sit somewhere and get stale, and who don't want to sit somewhere and not do interesting work because there's loads of interesting work to do.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good interesting point for us. That we draw a lot of strength from our expertise in one area, and I think the government has been through a shift in policy where we can move more laterally. But it's really nice to hear the rationale for that, because often it's that's not covered. I want to finish up with one question. I know we're really running out of time, but I think it would be good to hear from you about whole of government perspective and how we can get a more joined up approach, or at least recognition of the interrelatedness. And I think that was a question from Aisha.
Yes, that's right. Hello.
Hi, Aisha. How are you?
Good, thank you. I'm Aisha Armstrong. I'm recently new into the early childcare division, so very excited to be part of building that. And my question does come to a previous project when I worked in student admin. So I'm more on the delivery side of policies. And what we found is with student administration, for example, we had to deliver on and get systems to deliver on student behaviour, out of care home attendance, school finances. And what we found is the combined effect of these policies actually didn't give what we needed in schools. So we then reached out to policy owners. How does this work when your policy works with another policy? And then we're combining this policy with that policy. What does it mean for the system? So my question to you is, I guess, holistically, big picture view, when policy owners are creating policies, how are they doing that interdependency checks and balances? So when we come to implement it at program level, we are getting the effect that's desired and not the trains effect that you described earlier, where we're driving a wrong outcome because of combined business rules.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant question. It applies to both that kind of systems level. It applies to whole of government work. Absolutely. I've been guilty of it in reforms. You know, if I think about the kind of one of the things I was saying earlier about holding the space for the next problem to be solved, sometimes they're really big problems. So when I worked on the NDIS, the relationship with the NDIS and schools was an unresolved issue at the point we were all, but it was enough for everyone to be willing to agree, and then you have to work it out later. But that was explicit. And so I think there is something about what are the explicit things you know are problems you need to tackle. Some of this I think IT management does really well, by the way. The whole change request process, you know, we have an allergic reaction to it, but that discipline of saying, okay, if this policy is there, the unresolved things are this, and I'm going to tick them off. Too often, I think, in the policy space, we can get excited about the big idea and lose that discipline. So we need that partnership. You need that partnership with people who bring that to you and challenge you on that stuff. The way I think you get cut through is to focus policy around the user. It's why I talk about insights. It's why I talk about needing to gather not one anecdote, but a representative sample, you know, kind of who is it this is for? What is their shared and different experience based on their context, experience, background, whatever the right questions are for your issue, and how will this work for them? So I would, some of that is a consequence of time. Some of it is a consequence of not securing the right space to do the work. So in the work that Susie was talking about earlier, where we're looking at rewarding excellence for teachers, a big bit of the work will be tidying up, I refer to it as clearing up behind us. We have over years created a mess of positions in schools. You can be a specialist maths teacher or this or that or the other, you know, like kind of all sorts of, and they don't make sense to anybody and they don't have a clear sense of progression. So we've got to clear that up as we go. And you have to have those moments, I think, in systems where you do that, where you have the kind of, let's clear up what the consequence of layered good ideas are, because we now have a better view of what they look like together. So I think sometimes it's about time. I'm going to be probably controversial in this room. Sometimes it's just we haven't thought about it, and that's not good enough, actually, as policy people. It is not good enough. And my probably biggest bugbear as a secretary is getting briefs full of great ideas where no one has spoken to anyone else. And I'm immediately like, what's the impact on student enrolment? What's the impact on this? And I'm like, if it's getting to me and those questions are being answered, honestly, my view is people haven't done their job properly before it's got to me. So that is about defining your job and knowing what it looks like to do it well, and having that connection with delivery is part of it, and going through those questions is part of it. So I think there's a kind of, people can get lost in their own space, and we need to think about how we structure around that, right? Kind of, okay, if we have a set of experts in a particular field, what is it they need around them to ask? Make sure they ask different questions. Where's the contestability and challenge in those processes? And normally in those examples, I can look through and find a set of governance of groupthink, and I cannot see an invitation of those that will challenge in the process. And what I want around me and what I want in my team are people who will challenge me, people who will contest the ideas, people who will tell me I've got it wrong, because I have often, you know, we all do, like, and that's what you need to have in that process.
I think you've hit the nail on the head when you talked about the service thing. And if when designing a policy, you look at where that policy fits into that service and what other policies are in that service with you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you start at, in our world, a young person, a learner, and say, what did this look like? And if you then do, it's why I do really love the persona stuff. Like, I think it's a really effective device. What does this mean for a student? What does this mean for a learning support officer? What does this mean for a teacher? What does this mean for an early childhood service or staff member trying to prepare an younger person for that transition? That kind of thoroughness of thinking, the PhD thesis, is all the work we need to do to write a short brief. And too often we just write the brief.
Yeah.
Do the thesis, just don't write it at the end.
We are going to close now because although we could spend all day, I think, talking about this, I know you've got many other things to do, including, condensing that PhD thesis into a very concise brief that has thought about all the implications for our end users and for our layered policy experience. So I wanted to thank you, Georgina, for joining us today, and on behalf of the community of policy professionals, I wanted to thank you and your team as well, who have put a lot of time and effort into preparing, and I wanted to thank our audience for your interest and enthusiasm in policy. We'll be back in November with the Minister for the Environment, James Griffin, who has kindly offered to speak with us. So until then, take care.
Thanks all.